Good morning, and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim as we continue our journey, A Prophet in Babylon, with Chapter 14, The House of Joy. The plan of living in Washington Square was, as Gaunt had said, due to the practical intelligence of his wife. For her own part, she was as willing as her husband to live in the barest rooms in the poorest quarter of the city. The less they spent, the more they would have to give, was her prudent principle. But as the new movement outlined itself before her with increasing distinctness, she perceived that it probably would embrace all classes. Of course, the movement must go to the poor first. She heartily believed in the principle that all great religious movements began with the poor. But they do not stay there. Besides, the very conception of a league of service implied bringing the rich into contact with the poor. It meant the mobilization of wealth in the service of poverty, of culture in the service of ignorance. Therefore, the location of the movement must be central, and for that reason she insisted on Madison Square Garden. For the same reason she now thought of Washington Square for their home. It was the most central location in New York. It was close enough to the poor to retain the idea that the first object of the movement was for their benefit. Here Palmer came to her aid in an unexpected fashion. He and his sister had long lived in Washington Square, attracted by the old-fashioned spaciousness of its houses, from which fashion had long since departed. The one luxury they allowed themselves was a house with large rooms. In every other respect, their life was as simple as life in a log cabin. They had never furnished the upper part of the house, and had resisted many tempting offers to let it out for office purposes. It now occurred to them that the house might be easily adapted for the purposes of the League. They both hailed with delight the idea of Gaunt's coming to live with them. From that idea there was evolved the larger idea of something in the nature of community life. Esther Palmer was one of those gentle and reserved women who endure loneliness of life without complaint, but who are all the time looking for some object that can give a larger interest to their thoughts. She had long ago given up all visions of marriage. She had lived for her brother, but there were many hours in each day when he was absent, and she felt the lack of some positive, exacting duty. She read much, painted a little, studied music with some success, but none of these employments really filled the void in her life. One winter she took a course of classes in biology, less from any real aptitude for science than from the desire to fill her time. She attended to her brother's correspondence, sometimes wrote at his dictation an essay for the heavier magazines, and at all times followed his legal studies with much more appreciation than women are commonly able to display for severe and technical themes. She had come almost to the verge of middle life without losing her girlish grace and freshness. Her face, a perfect oval with a Madonna-like sweetness and composure, belied a little, however, by the wistful expression of her eyes. She was in some danger of becoming a Bluestocking. Under proper guidance, she might have become an authoress. But the years passed, and her devotion to her brother gradually swallowed up all other interests. And yet in her heart she still yearned for some broader avenue of activity, some interest that would lift her out of the happy monotony of her life. The idea of the League of Service at once appealed to her, and as Palmer developed his plans, she discerned the value of the idea of community life. Why not make their house not only Gaunt's home, but the expression of the new ideal of living? Fellowship would surely have its expression not only in public ways, but in the method of their own life. Gaunt himself gave the last formulating touch to the idea when he spoke of a hospice. She at once plunged into the scheme with delighted alacrity. The old house was transformed. The large dining room was made a refectory, and they resolved to keep open table. Most of the familiar furniture was sold and replaced by furniture of the simplest type. A long, plain oak table occupied the center of the room. Rugs and carpets were replaced by bare, stained floor. The walls were painted white, after the fashion of the old conventional refectories. At the end of the room, facing tall windows, was the large engraving of Velázquez's Christ on the Cross, which had formerly hung in Gaunt's library. This was the one touch of art which they permitted. The upstairs rooms were treated with the same simplicity. Some were meant to be occupied by any workers or assistants who might give themselves to the cause. Others were reserved for cases of distress, for the broken man who had no place to lay his head, the penitent daughter of shame who needed immediate rescue, or the deserted child. For above all, the house was to be a hospice. It must keep an open door to all the world. It must typify in its own way the ideal of fellowship. A hospice, the very word kindled Palmer's enthusiasm. It's something that has ceased to exist, even in Catholic communities, in any vital form, he said. There was a time when the religious houses of Europe were the houses of the people, dispensing generously to all comers and making no distinctions. Catholicism has lost the ideal. Protestantism never had it. We will revive it. I'm afraid we shan't look like nuns and monks, however, laughed Margaret. We all look too happy. Of course, said Palmer, and that's where the novelty comes in. Religion has never yet gone to partnership with joy. It has been afraid to. I suppose it's because religion has always seen men and women plastered over with dreadful theological labels, but we see them just as men and women. Let us call our hospice the House of Joy, exclaimed Gaunt. Splendid, exclaimed Palmer. That's the note we want to strike. We've heard too much of the pains and penalties of service. Let us emphasize the truth that life of service is the only joyous life. So, to the great astonishment of passers-by, the door of the house bore upon its white surface the inscription in golden letters, "The House of Joy." And certainly, if ever house knew the presence of joy, it was this old house in Washington Square in that week when the Gaunts came to live in it. They and the Palmers passed from room to room with the interest of children, examining the simple fitments and discussing the uses to which they would put them. The four happiest people in New York. Those rooms had doubtless known many merry gatherings. Light feet had danced upon the floors. Brides had come down the great staircase with lips athirst for love, song, and revel had filled the rooms, but in all of its history, no such joy had dwelt there as in these days. Outside, New York span like a roaring wheel, with its willing martyrs bound upon it, its crowds of men and women who sought with tortured lips some living spring in the whirl of sterile empty days, and sought in vain. Inside there was a great peace, and the water of contentment, and the bread of perfect fellowship. The life within did not belie the daring legend on the door. It was indeed the House of Joy. One of the first visitors they received was Gordon. Gaunt had recognized him in the congregation in Mayfield Avenue Church on the occasion of his farewell address, and among the letters which most cheered him was one from Gordon. The old man was delighted with what he saw. It was a realization of his own early dreams. "It makes me young again to see all this," he said. "I am very far from saying, 'Now, Lord, lettest thou servant depart in peace.' I am much more inclined to say, 'Now, Lord, let me live and work.' I am tempted to join you." "Why not?" said Gaunt, delightedly. "I am afraid I should not be worth my salt. Someone once proposed that all ministers should be taken out and shot at 40. I am 80 years old." "80 years young," said Gaunt. "You were young enough to conceive the movement. You are young enough to serve it." "If I thought I was," he said wistfully. "Think you are, and you will be," retorted Gaunt, with a gay laugh. "I will quote you your own doctrine, that the men who have the most to do live the longest. Their work vitalizes them, you know." "That's the worst of advising other people," said Gordon. "They invariably return the advice with interest. However, tell me what I can do, and let me consider it." "You are already our prophet," said Gaunt. "All the prophets wrote books, I believe, or are reputed to have done so. Write our prophetic books for us. Express our ideas. There are none of us who will have the time when once work begins." Alas, I am but a discredited prophet, said the old man. Rather a prophet who has lived long enough to outlive discredit and get his message published at last, said Gaunt. The old man was silent for a long time. He felt that he had become enamored of loneliness. That solitude of his life at Riverside had become necessary to his power of thinking. But now that a call to positive service had come to him, his heart quickened in him with a swift revival of its early fires. Old men have no time to debate, he said at length. They hear too clearly the voice that says, What thou doest, do quickly. I will come if you will have me. And so one more was added to the community of the House of Joy. One of the smaller rooms in the topmost story of the house was assigned to him, to which he brought the most indispensable part of his library. And from that little room in the coming days went forth many of those pamphlets which did so much to disseminate the ideas of the League and to stir the hearts of men throughout the world. These were very busy days in the House of Joy, in which there was scarce leisure to eat, yet Gaunt was conscious of an enthusiasm of spirit which he had never known before. He was incapable of fatigue, and he knew that the explanation was that his work was now absolutely congenial. He had always imagined that when he resigned his church, the resignation would leave behind a long groundswell of regret. On the contrary, he now experienced an immense sense of relief. He grew younger every day and looked younger. He often recollected Gordon's phrases about the exhaustion that attended a life spent in trifles. He saw now that very much of his previous life in the church answered to that description. What had continually chafed and irritated him was the atmosphere of pettiness in which he had been compelled to work. He had had to fight for even the most reasonable and insignificant innovations against the timidity of men like Tasker and the dislike of men like Roberts. How many sleepless nights had he spent over things of no real moment? The recollection of unkind words, the small diplomacies that held together men of opposite temperaments, to say nothing of those constant irritations which arose in guiding the course of various organizations, each one jealous of its neighbor. He was now a soldier relieved from tedious task work, who hears the trumpet sound and is filled with the gaiety of battle. He breathed freer, walked with firmer steps, moved erect, conscious in every thought and act of great liberation. And that's the end of Chapter 14, Part A. Next week we'll continue with Chapter 14, Part B. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.